Chapter 1 is really an introduction to this course. Now, when most of us think about living a healthy life, we generally think about health outcomes, we might think about fitness outcomes, or it might be a performance outcome, or some combination of those. But ultimately, what they all collectively embody is this idea of personal wellness, right? And so when we think about personal wellness, right, we have to kind of take this expansive view, because for most of us, when we think of this idea of wellness, it's really, are we, living the healthiest life where we're free of the risk of mortality and morbidity? Are we living a life where we're pain-free? Are we living a life where we can perform our activities without any restriction? So we kind of think of the physical element of what wellness means. But the reality is, wellness is something that encompasses so much more. It's represented in this pie chart as kind of the multiple dimensions, because the reality is they're all connected. Yes, physical wellness is probably the linchpin or the springboard to improving all of those. Because the reality is, if you were in better shape, right, that may influence your occupational wellness, because if you're healthier and someone who's in better shape, you probably have greater energy levels, which means you might be able to perform better at work, which could then allow you to be more productive and get more recognition for what you're doing and maybe given more opportunities for advancement, right? We also know that physical fitness or physical activity has huge implications on your cognitive abilities as well as your emotional states, right? So yes, our physical kind of slice, if you want to call it, really has kind of a trickle effect in positively influencing all of those, but not necessarily in every one of them. But nonetheless, if we want to live this idea of being kind of the best version of ourselves, then what we have to realize is that it's more than just exercise and nutrition. Even though, the focus of all these chapters will be on those two elements, all right, there is conversation where we talk about other aspects of wellness. You will see as you read through these chapters that we have conversation about stress and sleep, all right, and mindset, all right, and also rest and recovery, for example. Because when we look at what affects wellness, all right, sure, there's certain things that we cannot influence. You might say genetics. There is a genetic link or a predisposition that we all have in terms of what kind of health and fitness and performance we're going to be able to sustain or achieve, sorry. But we also know that it's influenced by many other things. And some examples would include our environment. Now, the environment is not just the environment we live in. In other words, is the air healthy? Is there, weather that's allowing me to be outside and be active? Is there toxins in the environment? But it's also having access and convenience of, access to healthy eating. Like, is there a fresh market? All right. Do I have access to recreational spaces where I can be, active, like not just a gym, but even outdoors? Now, we also know that there's healthcare. Are you actively engaged with, your own health? Is there access to good quality healthcare? But as you see in that pie chart, the biggest piece or the biggest chunk of what contributes to wellness is our lifestyle choices, the life we live. Now, for many of us, we look at, lifestyle would be this idea of being physically active, in other words, exercising, right? And eating well. And yes, those are strong anchors. But I want you to think bigger than that. When we think about wellness, I talk about the 5 pillars of transformation. And in that, I talk about, yes, we know that there's muscle and metabolism. So what we mean by that is, training to strengthen your muscles and strengthen your bones. We also know that if we can exercise, that improves our metabolism. And metabolism is not just about burning more calories, but it's also about metabolic health. Now, it's being free of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. And we know that today, more than ever, we're seeing more and more research speaking to the idea that movement is a great starting place, because even movement can confer health benefits upon your body. And for most of us, we focus on those 3. We focus about going to the gym and, eating well. And sure, nutrition isn't muscle, nutrition isn't metabolism, although it does have a bit of an impact on that. Nutrition isn't movement, so where is nutrition? Well, that falls under the umbrella of mindfulness. And the idea of mindfulness is just being more self-aware of the decisions you are making and the behaviors that you are performing. And nutrition is a big part of that. But so is stress, so is sleep. So is paying attention to your body for signs of overtraining. In other words, getting the appropriate amounts of rest and recovery. So through the chapters you're going to read, we will have some conversation, pretty extensive, on not just nutrition, but being more mindful, all right, about how we eat and what we eat, but also being mindful of the stress that you live with and the sleep that you're getting, and whether you're getting enough rest and recovery. But collectively, mindfulness is a big, important part of that lifestyle. But then we have to really talk about where it all starts. And that's your mindset. Most of us know that we probably need to move more and eat less. But why don't we? So part of what we're going to be doing in these first chapters is really helping you understand more about your own mindset. So that you can understand, how are you thinking about things? Because at the end of the day, a lot of the behavioral decisions you make are driven by how you think and how you feel. Now, some would say that how you think impacts how you feel. In other words, your cognitive thought process, your thoughts dictate your emotions. Now, not everyone agrees with that, but that is certainly a connection between the two. So if I can change mindset, in other words, to get you to think more positively, that might also change your emotional states. And what we're trying to do is to shift your mindset from this idea of I cannot, or I'm thinking about doing, to I have started and I'm continuing to do. In other words, shaping healthy behavioral habits. And so when we look at this idea of optimal wellness, we can take that 5 pillars of transformation and kind of break it down into these ideas right here, that we're going to focus on health and fitness. We're going to focus on ways that we can actually do what? Help positively influence the way you think and the way you feel. And how, these can collectively translate into improved social, recreational, environmental relationships, or how those can positively impact wellness by the impact that they have upon our health and fitness. So it's kind of I wouldn't say a cycle, but there is kind of an interrelationship between all these aspects right there. Now, yes, the focus here will be on the idea of physical activity or exercise and nutrition. Now, we know that there is an abundance of information that speaks to the benefits of movement and activity. Now, when we say movement, this has been more of a recent understanding. When I say activity, I'm talking about being physically active or exercising. And we've had data maybe for the better part of the last 50 to 75 years that has indicated that if we exercise, we see a myriad of health benefits. Kind of like you see in that word cloud right there, all right? We can improve many aspects of our life, many aspects of that concept of wellness. And the research is irrefutable. It's out there, all right? And to some degree, it's also dose related, that the more you do, the greater the benefits you receive. To a point, there is always a threshold where too much is not necessarily better. Think of the idea of overtraining and how it compromises your immune system, which makes you more vulnerable to illness and injury. But why I'm introducing this concept of movement is because more recently, in other words, the last, let's say, 10 years or so, we've seen kind of a shift in where research has been taking us to this idea of where we're now discovering, and fortunately for us, that short bouts of accumulated exercise are beneficial and maybe even sometimes equally beneficial to sustained bouts of exercise like we do in the gym. Now that presents a wonderful opportunity because for a lot of people, for a lot of us, one of the biggest barriers to adopting a healthy lifestyle is the commitment I have to make, the investment I need to make into finding time to, go to the gym, to carve out this chunk of time in my already busy day to go exercise or to perform healthy behaviors such as preparing meals. But we're sticking with exercise right now, right? So let's continue our conversation there. And what we're seeing, for example, in that little table is that new research is telling us how any increment of movement, now ideally at least a 10-minute interval, performed at a moderate or a higher intensity. But if you do that sporadically through the day or repetitively through the day, where you have at least 30 minutes of recovery between those individual bouts, that can confer the same benefits as a single bout of sustained exercise like 30 minutes of cardio. Now, we're seeing this, but we also realize that even 5 minutes of movement is healthy. For example, after eating a meal, generally what we experience is an increase in our blood sugar levels. And what the body does is releases a hormone, insulin. Because insulin's job is to try and remove those nutrients, especially glucose, out of the blood and put them into the cells. But if you were to eat too much, where the body had to release lots of insulin, what might manifest itself long-term as a result of this is the bombardment of our receptors that respond to insulin, much like a key goes into our lock. Insulin is a hormone in the blood that binds to receptors on the muscle and the fat cells, and it can move nutrients into those cells. And if we had to constantly bombard those cells with insulin, they develop some resistance. And that's what type 2 diabetes is. But what recent research is showing is that if you can, after a meal, take a 5-minute walk, as little as a 5-minute walk, it can actually help reduce the likelihood of you developing that insulin resistance. So the difference between creating movement or not going for a walk, or even could even be a little bit of weight training like push-ups and curls, crunches and jumping jacks, versus doing something like that, could be the difference between developing insulin resistance and not. So the idea of these short bouts of accumulated exercise, the lay terms that we're seeing now is called exercise snacking or movement minutes, has become a great opportunity, because when we're faced with that decision that I need to carve out time to go exercise, and yet I'm prioritizing some other things in my life like my school and my job and my family, a lot of times it comes at a cost of that commitment to exercise. So now it's less about I don't have time to do this, and more of I can carve out 5 minutes here and 10 minutes there throughout my day just to be active. So it's lowered that barrier to entry, that opportunity to overcome the inertia that's required to bring about change. And so that's going to be a conversation we're going to have through these chapters, is that it doesn't have to be exercise. Yes, we know exercise has a myriad of benefits, like you see in that word cloud. But for some, it's not the starting point. For some of us, we need a simple starting process. And that's where exercise snacking or movement minutes can help. We also know that nutrition has the opportunity to confer a bunch of benefits to our body, right? Here's just a short example. Yes, if we eat well, we generally have greater levels of energy and vitality. If we eat well, all right, and we avoid things like trans fats and saturated fats in excess, all right, we enjoy a longer life. We enjoy a better quality of life, free of disease. We know that it contributes positively to our physical health. We also know that good nutrition can also improve our cognitive function. Yes, there are certain foods that actually promote, right, a healthier brain, not just a healthier body. So it stands to reason that when we talk about this idea of wellness, it will primarily encompass nutrition and kind of this idea of activity or exercise. But I also want you to think beyond those. And we're going to talk about stress and sleep and, changing your mindset, things of that nature, because at the end of the day, you have to have kind of a comprehensive approach if you want to achieve or become the best version of yourself. And what I mean by that is the healthiest version of yourself. What I also have to recognize is that we don't all participate in an exercise routine, or we don't all choose to be physically active for the same reasons. For some of us, it might purely be health and longevity, something that's probably more relevant with a older population than a younger population, where these are more, relevant or more of a focus in our lives. For some of us, it might be purely functionality. I would like to be able to live my life, to do the activities I choose to do without restriction in the absence of pain. In other words, to move efficiently so that I don't create injury. For some of us, it's purely about fitness. We're fitness enthusiasts where we just love to exercise and what exercise brings. Could be something internal like a sense of, well-being, or it could be purely for aesthetics. It could also be that you're a recreational individual who's a recreational enthusiast who loves to do certain things outside of the gym, and you recognize that training in the gym improves your capacity for doing those activities. I train so I'm in better shape so I can play, more games with my children or my friends. I train in the gym so that I can enjoy my rock climbing. And then for others, it is purely performance, whether you're an athlete or you're someone who has an occupation that demands high levels of physical exertion, like being a firefighter or a soldier. So as you're going through these chapters, one thing I recognize is that we all have our own reasons for participating in physical activity, for choosing to be healthy. And what that means is that there's no one best approach. And that's something that I want you to kind of really commit to, because, listening to your friend or to that fitness influencer, all right, is not necessarily the best path, because number one, they may not have much credibility. In other words, what they share with you may not be rooted in science. But number two is they might be in it for different reasons, or the fact that even if they are in it for the same reason as you, their body is very different from yours. In other words, what works for them may not work with you. So what we need to do, and what I'm hoping to accomplish as you read through these chapters, is that you, first of all, identify what are your reasons, and then as you are learning and expanding your knowledge, you come to realize that you may have several choices. When I say choices, I mean approaches. And I cannot tell you what will be the best approach, nor can anyone else. Not your friend, not your fitness influencer, not a strength and conditioning coach. No one knows what is the best approach other than you. And so you're going to have to find your path. And the best way to do that is to understand the science around what you're trying to do, which gives you an understanding of the why, so that you can find your what and how. And that's going to be an objective of everything that you're going to read through these chapters.